Good evening, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde. Buonasera. Thanks for being here with us. My name is Christopher DiRaddo, and I'm very excited to see so many people here tonight. This event's been a long time coming. Christopher Castellani was supposed to be here with us back in 2020 for Blue Metropolis. But then sadly that event got canceled because of COVID, and we've been in touch periodically ever since. Trying to find another time for you to come. And it was going to happen in July, but then that also was derailed. So I'm happy that you're finally in the seat. And look, it's Pride, it's also a Tau Fest. The weather is so much nicer than it was going to be that night that you were
You're
welcome. But before we begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. The Kanien'kehá:ka are recognized as custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today, and Tiohtià:ke, otherwise known as Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. And today, a diverse Indigenous population, as well as other peoples, reside here. It is with respect for the connections to the past, present, and future that we recognize the ongoing relationships between Indigenous peoples and others in the Montreal community. I'd also like to thank those who helped make this event possible. First, I'd like to thank Sandra Capelli, Laura Mollet, and the team here at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura Montreal for being such wonderful hosts. We did an event together here last year, Queer and Italian in Montreal, and it was such an incredible event. I'm really honored to be here again this year, once more with your support. I also want to thank Domenico A. Beneventi, who's here as well, and the Équipe de Recherche en Études Queer au Québec. They are the ones that helped bring Christopher to town, and I could not have done it without them. Thanks also to Michael Belcher, who's here as well, and Brooke Lee from the Violet Hour for their support. Violet Hour now produces approximately 25 events a year, and any additional support I receive is extremely valuable. And lastly, I'd also like to thank Blue Metropolis and Paragraph Books, thank you Andres, for their in-kind support as well. So allow me to introduce our special guest here tonight. Christopher Castellani lives in Boston and in Provincetown, Massachusetts. The son of Italian immigrants and a native of Wilmington, Delaware, Christopher was educated at, I meant to ask you how to pronounce this. Do we pronounce the R? Swarthmore?
Yes.
Swarthmore College. Received his master's in English literature from Tufts and has a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Boston University. His first novel, A Kiss from Madalena, won the Massachusetts Book Award in 2004. Its follow-up, The Saint of Lost Things, was a Book Sense notable book. And the final novel in the trilogy, All This Talk of Love, was a New York Times Editor's Choice and a finalist for the Farrell Grumley Literary Award. His collection of essays on point of view fiction, titled The Art of Perspective, Who Tells the Story, was published in 2016 and is taught in many creative writing workshops. Christopher's most recent novel is Leading Men, which we'll be speaking about tonight. The book centers on the life of Frank Merlo, the somewhat forgotten working-class Italian-American who was transformational in the life and works of Tennessee Williams. In addition to writing, Christopher is also on the faculty and academic board of the Warren Wilson MFA program and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and since 2019 he has chaired the writing panel at Young Arts, and for nearly 20 years he was in executive leadership at Grub Street, where he founded the Muse and Marketplace Conference and led the development of numerous literary programs for adults, teens, and seniors. Please give a warm welcome to Christopher Castellani. So we're going to be sharing the microphone. We're going to start off with a reading. I thought, that's a perfect place to start. So do you mind reading for us a little bit?
Can I just start by saying thank you to you, Christopher, for putting this all together, and to Sandro and to everyone who was involved with bringing me here. As Chris said, it's been a while, and I've been, since that event was canceled in May. I believe it was May of 2020. I've been really wanting to find a way to get here because partly through talking with you and reading about the different cultural events and literary events that happen here, I wanted to be a part of it in some way. So I feel really, really, truly honored to be here and immensely grateful for all the, I have been involved with enough organizations, as you mentioned, to know how much machinery it takes just to get one dude up here, from a city not that far away. And so I just really, really appreciate all that you've done and all that so many others have done. And of course, all of you for being here to be a part of it. So yeah, I'm gonna read just for 5-ish minutes, so you don't have to panic too much. Just from the first 3 pages of this novel, and it shouldn't need any more introduction than you've already been given. So I will just start with the beginning. Truman was throwing a party in Portofino, and Frank wanted to go. The invitation came in mid-July, slipped between parentheses in the long, gossipy paragraphs of his letter to 10, as if daring him to acknowledge it. Frank read the letter in Ten's absence. He'd been stuck for weeks in their stuffy 4th-floor apartment on Via Firenze, waiting for him to get back from Spain, while on the loud streets below, the real Romans escaped for the mountains. He replied to Truman with a brief telegram, and then he called the finest hotel in town, the Splendido, to book a room. He auditioned various linen jackets and swim trunks and hats in the mirror above the dresser, mended 2 pairs of 10 socks, and walked their silks down to the cleaners.
Is it because of the proximity to the speaker?
I just want to, yeah.
Maybe you can...
Should I move? Yeah.
Maybe that's
Walk their silks down to the cleaners. When 10 returned home to find their bags lined up in the hall, packed for another trip, he didn't protest. He was sweet on Frank again, after 3 weeks apart. A drive in the Jag up the coast of Liguria, far from the melting heart of the Centro, could only make things sweeter. They took one last walk through the Villa Borghese. They followed 2 boys, the dark one, 10's, the blonde for Frank, down the Spanish steps and out the eastern side to the Corso, pulled along by the smoothness of their elbows. Not a hint of saggy skin on 10's boy, his long arms tanned by lazy days on the beach at Ostia, or on Frank's, a Swiss. Who could say where the Swiss got that scar, new and pink across the knob of the elbow, or where he spent his own empty afternoons? Who could say he was a Swiss at all, and not from some disappointing place like Minnesota? They could say, Frank and 10, walking at a safe distance behind the boys, as they liked so very much to do evenings after dinner, those summers they lived in Rome, inventing lives for the Italians, inventing lives for themselves. It's what 10 was famous for. It was one of the many happy ways they passed their time together. They brought back the dark one, Mario, to Via Firenze. A Sicilian, like Frank, it turned out, but at least he wasn't American. As he hastily slipped on his espadrilles, color rising in his cheeks, Frank said to him, "You've just slept with one of the world's greatest writers." And because Mario had heard of Tennessee Williams, he stayed for the coffee and the pastries Frank brought onto the terrace. Soon Mario grew tiresome, as they all did, talking of his mother, who expected him home, who worried. There was always a mother. And they watched with relief as he and his tight elbows descended the stairs. He wasn't the first Mario. Of course, over the years they forgot their names, but not their scars or their attitudes or the stories they told as they lay between them late into the night. Sometimes on their evening walks, the streets sultry and flickering with shadows, they'd spot one of the Marios in a piazza with his pack of friends, laughing, his arm slung over a girl's shoulder. If the Mario noticed them, he'd turn his face away or shoot back a look of defiance and shame and fear, which enlarged them. They left Rome like this, big as elephants, the heat and storms behind them, the top down on the Jag for Portofino. Frank slept most of the way, his head on 10's lap, and then again on the skiff from Rapallo, though 10 kept nudging him awake to point out the houses on the cliffs. "You like the orange?" he said. He asked. "The yellow?" "No, that blue up top. I'm shopping, Frankie. Any of these can be ours." Truman had rented an apartment a few steps from the harbor above the Delfino restaurant, which Frank and 10 passed on their way up the hill to the Splendido. Ten paid the boat guy to carry their luggage, and when the hill got too steep, Frank grabbed the heavy case with the typewriter. He didn't like it when another guy did work for him that he could do himself, a guy who would have been him if he'd never left Jersey. The Splendido was first a monastero, the boat guy told them, and now look at it, que spettacolo, the place Clark Gable drinks his brandy to a view. 10 went straight to the desk as usual, and Frank arranged their dress shirts on hangers and brought their shoes down for shining and stole another hour for a nap. He'd never felt so tired in the middle of the afternoon, and he chalked it up to being 30. But it's possible. No doctor was ever able to tell him for sure, one way or the other, that the trouble had already started in his lungs. When he woke, 10 offered him a pill. 10 had as many pills as Italy had houses on the water. But Frank wasn't taking pills, not then. Instead, he smoked another cigarette and paid the boat guy to drive him over the mountain to Baraji Beach, where he swam to find the strength to clear his head. They didn't like Truman much, but Frank didn't hate him the way 10 did, or maybe 10 didn't hate Truman. It was hard to know for sure with 10. It was a job in itself keeping track of who he was angry with, who was jealous of him, whose parties he was looking forward to, and whose they'd have to make up some excuse to get out of. Frank's official job was as 10's secretary, but even his secretary didn't have a reason for being in Portofino other than to stop by Truman's party, and he didn't know when they'd be leaving. There wasn't much Frank knew in the summer of 1953, least of all, how long he and 10 might last. In those years, there was no such thing as early, late, or on time. They went from place to place on a magic carpet, dropped here, dropped there, women in electric dresses, men in monkey suits and bow ties, made of white silk, cognac, cigars, wine, the sky turquoise, even when it was gray. Because 10 had no mind and little use for schedules and logistics and coordinates, he needed Frank to organize the day they woke to, and the coming days, and even the days before. The dinner they had in London, 10 swore they'd had in Chicago, the party for the Sweet Bird of Youth tryout in Philadelphia, he remembered as the one in New Haven for Camino Real. The life of Tennessee Williams was a memory play in which memory was a jumble. It was bodies he remembered, bodies they remembered together. His body and Frank's, the Southern Gentleman and the Little Horse, the bodies of all the Marios from Key West to Marrakesh. When it came to matters of the body, Frank and 10 trusted each other like soldiers. I'll stop there.
Thank you. You really left out, I feel like, in terms of subject matter. You stumbled onto quite a rich playground for a writer, learning about the life of Frank Merlo. Merlo? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
I've heard both, Merlo or Merlot.
Merlo, okay. So, learning about his life and his relationship with Tennessee Williams, can you tell us about how you first came upon their story and what made you decide to give them second lives?
Sure.
Thank you. And I should have said at the beginning of that reading that Tennessee's nickname for Frank was the Little Horse, and that was the title of the chapter, and that was the reference to the little horse in the in that sentence. I was picture it, 1999, Delaware, where I'm from. It was a Friday night, and because I'm super cool, what I did on a Friday night back then was I was at a used bookstore, and I was leafing through the books, and there was a memoir. Well, there was the cover of a book, and that was called Tennessee. Cry of the Heart, right? And it was a photo of Tennessee Williams shirtless, kind of doing this, looking kind of anguished. And I knew Tennessee Williams. I wasn't a huge Tennessee Williams fan. I knew what Streetcar Named Desire was, Glass Menagerie, but I wasn't a huge fan necessarily. But I started paging through the book, and I came almost immediately upon this scene of this memoir written by one of his friends named Dotson Rader, and I came immediately upon the scene of this working class Italian man named Frank Merlo, who was from New Jersey. I read in the scene, who was dying in a hospital bed in New York in 1963, and Dotson, the author, was talking about how Tennessee Williams, his partner of all these years, wouldn't visit him on his deathbed, and talked a lot about Frank and what he was like, and again, that he was this working class guy from New Jersey. And I'm not sure I even knew that Tennessee Williams was gay, because I didn't know, much. I mean, I guess I must have known that on some level, but I didn't really think about it, hadn't really thought about it. And then I certainly had no idea that he had a partner who was essentially someone like me, right? Because I was in Delaware, I was Jersey, I knew people like Frank. And so I immediately had this identification with him. And the more I read in this memoir, of course I bought it, and then I read this entire very dishy memoir, and I just became a little bit obsessed with the idea of this guy who I learned had not been Williams's muse, like not the person that he inspired him to write necessarily, but who created the space for him to write. He did, as I went to many pains in the first pages of that book to emphasize, was the one who mended the shirts and bought the tickets and carried the luggage and performed these kinds of, like, for lack of a better word, kind of wifely duties for the great artist, and gave him the space to do his work. And so I became obsessed with that story, and also, of course, the first scene where I met him, which was him dying of lung cancer at the age of 40, and Williams not visiting him. And so I really wanted to write about them and explore their relationship, figure out how they met, and how they got from that to that bed, and to explore that relationship. And the last thing I'll say is that I didn't know that I could even do that as a fiction writer. I didn't know that that was an option. My first thought was I'd have to write a biography of him, because you can't put a real person in a novel. But then, not long after I had started with the film Gods and Monsters, and I saw how, which was about James Whale, the director of Frankenstein, and a kind of half-fictionalized version of his life. And then I read the novel that was based on, and I thought, oh, you can write a novel you could put a real person in a novel. And so that was where it started, and I wrote a short story, and then it expanded and expanded and expanded into this novel. Sorry, very long answer.
No.
We love long answers.
I'm going to warn you, I give long answers, so be careful of the next question.
So tell us a little bit, you told us a little bit about like Frank Merlo, and you said that you kind of saw yourself in him. Can I ask you to maybe expand upon that a little bit more? What exactly about his identity and his experience that kind of resonated with you?
Certainly, as I mentioned, working class guy. He drove a van, a truck, making deliveries. His family looked a lot like mine. The more I got to not know them personally, although I have met one of my family members since then, which I could talk about. But the more I learned about him, they looked like my family, big, sprawling Italian New Jersey family. But beyond that, what resonated for me was that he was kind of caught up in, or found himself in this world that was very different from his, kind of glittering. I mean, the world, the stratum of literary fame that he traveled in was, at the very top in that, at that time, and found himself there, and was not born to be in that space, right? I mean, that is not the space that his family ever imagined for him, that he ever maybe imagined for himself. And I related to that because, I'm the only member of my family, my immigrant Italian family, to finish college, to get a graduate degree. Almost the only member of my extended family to move more than 50 miles from our house, right? And I've always felt a little bit out of place in, for lack of a better word, like the ivory tower, I went to a graduate program in English literature, as you mentioned, I get to sometimes hobnob with fancy writers and go to cultural events like this. And I've always, as happy as I am in these spaces, I've always felt like, you know, my dad worked at a bakery. Like my mom was a seamstress. They neither of them made it past second grade, you know. And still, my mother can't read English. You know, my father, you know. Anyway, so I've always kind of, I've always, you know, I've always kind of, I drew on some of that to think about Frank. But I will say that one thing that I don't want people to think is that Frank was some kind of like rube, you know. He was an incredible reader. He probably was better read than Tennessee Williams, and Williams said that himself. He was a huge opera fanatic. He was very artistic. He was a dancer. He was an actor. He was not some like, you know, stereotypical, you know, bricklayer Italian who they kept around and was grunting. You know, that wasn't him, right? He was a very educated or a very self-educated literary cultural person, so I just want to make sure that was clear.
You know, in addition to Tennessee and Frank, you know, there are a number of other real people in the book, right? You know, there's Truman Capote, as you mentioned, who we see as a friend and a rival, which is fascinating, frenemy. There's also the novelist John Orrin Burns, director Luchino Visconti, novelist Paul Bowles, Italian actress Anna Magnani. What was it like for you to kind of play in this space and giving words to these people? Were you big fans of theirs? Was it intimidating?
Yes, and yes. Right? I mean, and to me it felt like, you know, having action figures of people that you're interested in and just putting them on, you know, a surface and like making them do fun things, you know. And so I some of them I didn't know as well. I didn't know Visconti as well when I first started, you know, started researching the book, and then I learned that the time that I was writing about that Williams spent in Italy with Frank was the same time that Visconti was filming Senso, and that Williams was writing the script to it. So I got to know him through that, and Magnani I was a huge fan of. She's everything, you know, she's everything. And so it was just great fun. I had a blast writing her lines. I had fun with Visconti. I had fun with all of them, Paul Bowles, all of them. The one that terrified me was Capote. I was absolutely terrified to write dialogue from Truman Capote because he's one of the wittiest, sharpest, most vicious, and I felt like I had to live up to that kind of reputation. So I stressed a lot about those particular scenes, and you know, I don't know whether I pulled it off, but those are the ones that I had the most. What I didn't have was I didn't ever have the feeling like I shouldn't do this. Like once I understood the genre of writing about real people and putting real people in novels, I got over even writing about Frank in Tennessee. Like, I can do this. I am a novelist, I'm a fiction writer, that's why it says, you know, at the beginning of the book, a novel, you know. I can write whatever I want, you know. So I didn't worry that I didn't have the permission. All I worried about was, am I doing right by these characters? Am I doing right by them? That was my main concern.
So among the fictional people that you've created, is a Garble-like film icon named Anja Blomgren, who changes her name to Anja Bloom in the book. When we meet her, she's an ingenue and attending Truman Capote's party with her very memorable mother. How did this fictional character, because she plays a big role in the book, and I'm curious, how did this fictional character find her way into this coterie of queer legends?
So one of the struggles I had in the book was I wanted to write about Frank mostly, but I felt like the book was too claustrophobic to be just a story about Frank in Tennessee. I felt like it needed, what my editor said was air. Like, you felt like the book that Anya, I call her Anya, other people call her Anja. I think the correct way is Anja because she's Swedish, but I don't know, for some reason it doesn't sound right to me. So anyway. So I had written this character before the editor, but the editor had said that Anya gives the novel air, and so I felt like I needed and wanted a female character because women were so important to Frank and to Tennessee in particular. All of his great main characters are women, right? Blanche Dubois and Maggie the Cat, and I mean, these are all his great people, and most of their closest friends were women. So I really felt like I wanted a female character, but I didn't want to just throw some woman in there and see what happened, right? I wanted it to sort of feel organic to the story. So I was reading, I did a ton of research, and as I was reading letters of Truman Capote, I came upon this bit of his, this bit of a letter that was written during the very same month of the party that he actually threw, that I read a little about. That was a real party that he invited Tennessee and Frank to. And during the very same month that he invited Tennessee, he wrote to David O. Selznick, there are some simply extraordinary people in Portofino. The place is rampant with the kinds of goings-on. Jennifer, who's David's wife, Jennifer never really believes go on. There's an Australian girl who ran away with her stepfather, and a Swedish mother and daughter who share a fisherman between them, etc. His words. But these are very ordinary instances. Altogether, the place is fraught with peril. And I just, for some reason, when I read that, I thought, that's the one of those two women, the mother or the daughter or both. That's the woman for the novel. That she's going to be in there somehow. And I had no idea who she was. I still don't know who she was. I don't know if anybody knows who she was other than Truman, who's dead. That's literally where it came from, and I just kind of dreamt her up, and then I had actually met. I dreamt her up, and I put her in the story, and I created some scenes for her, and then this is going to sound really annoying and name dropping and obnoxious, but I was at a party once, and the actress Liv Ullmann was there, right? Who is like among the most amazing actresses of all time. And was it? You did? Isn't she the most wonderful? Oh my gosh, she's incredible. And she also is a writer, and her daughter's a writer.
I have her autograph.
Oh, nice. Excellent. No worries. And so I was at this party, and I told her that I was writing a novel about Tennessee Williams, and she told me this story about Tennessee Williams that I can tell you if we have time later. It's a longish story, but it's very funny. And then I kind of looked at her and I thought, like you're the character. Like I'm kind of gonna the character of Anya is you. Like or some version of you, right? Like she grows up to become you, and that's kind of what it's. Yeah.
I have to say this really excites me because I love these coincidences in where running into Liv, seeing this paragraph in like Truman's notes, even that fact that Visconti was there while you were, it all lines up and it makes you feel like you're doing the right thing, you're following the right path. So I lead a book discussion group called the Violet Hour Book Club, and your book was our July selection. A bunch of members here tonight. Shout out. And one of the things we discussed was the term historical fiction, and I believe you used the term alternative history fiction in the book. In essence, you're creating a possible but not necessarily true narrative for a very famous person. And I'm kind of curious, like, were you concerned at all about the line that where is the line that can be drawn when writing about famous people? Because some people might take it for fact, So how did you negotiate that when you were writing the story?
Good question. So every writer does it differently. Some writers, I know some writers who put real people in their novels who give this real person a daughter that they never had, right? And make it as if they always had them, or like just blatantly bend the truth, and that's great. I mean, that's their choice, and that's why it says a novel at the beginning. I had decided early on that what I wanted the novel to be was, as you alluded to, like everything in this book could have happened. I was like obsessed with making sure that they were never at any point at a place in the novel where they weren't in real life, like, for example, right? Or, so I got to, make sure the dates all lined up. And so it was very important to me that I was telling a story that could have happened and that revealed something about them that I thought was true and that could only be, or that could be most dramatically explored in a condensed way, and condensed is the wrong word, well, it's the best I come up with now, like a condensed way in fiction. Like you're kind of you're condensing time and making things happen in a short period of time as a way of exploring the way things always were, or the way things were for them, in their lives. So, so that's why I kind of condensed the timeline of the parts that are in Italy and really made it a few months in Italy in 1953. And I wanted to have that kind of stand for, or represent, I should say, their relationship, and why Anya's sections span many, many years, because I had more freedom with her because she wasn't real. So that was my choice, right? And to do it that way. But another writer might have made a different choice, and might have chosen to change history more. But again, it was really important to me that that everything could have happened. Everything that happened in the book could have happened. But they take on a different kind of meaning in the context that I created for them. So does that answer it? Okay.
Totally.
Yeah.
But Tennessee Williams has a lot of devoted fans, right? And I can imagine, the book coming out and people going, "Oh wow, this is interesting." And I'm curious, there are plenty of scholars out there. Did you get any blowback also from just deciding to do this, or did you get did people kind of come out of the woodwork to congratulate you? Because also you write a play, you put in a whole play there, like a lost play by Tennessee Williams. So we're not giving too many spoilers here, which is very ballsy, I think, to do. So what was the reaction, I guess, maybe among some of those scholars of this work?
Yeah. I was definitely very nervous about the way the book would be received by the Tennessee Williams community, because there are lots of people in that community, lots of people that Tennessee Williams means a lot to, and who have spent their lives obsessing over every word he's written and are very protective of his memory and of his legacy. And I always meant from the beginning, I never meant the book to be in any way a criticism of anybody, or a what's the word, hagiography, making Frank into a saint, right? That wasn't the point either. So I wanted to write a true portrait of a relationship that was very tumultuous, but also very loving in its own way, that had its own terms. And I wanted to do it as honestly and with as much imagination as I could muster. But again, I was aware that there are these people who are very protected. I was incredibly relieved that, other than, everybody gets very cranky reviews on, Amazon or Goodreads or everywhere else. So I definitely was prepared for those, and I definitely got those. But not from anybody who was I don't want to sound snooty, but not anybody who was a Tennessee Williams scholar of note, and in fact, I was so lucky that Viking, my publisher, actually hired a Tennessee Williams scholar named Thomas Keith, who is probably the best regarded Tennessee Williams scholar. They hired him to read a manuscript of Leading Men ahead of time before publication, and he went through it and flagged anything that he felt was inauthentic to Williams. And so this is a little behind the scenes DVD extra. There's a scene in sort of the 80s when Anya and Tennessee meet at a hotel and they have lunch, and Tennessee is trashing, in the original version, Tennessee was trashing another playwright who had won the Pulitzer, I think, that year. And the language he was using was very vulgar in my original version. And Thomas said, he wouldn't say that. He would never. I mean, again, who knows if he was right? But he's like, he wouldn't put it that way. He would say it this way. He would couch it in these terms. He would be like Iron Fist. Is that the right term? Iron Fist in a velvet glove. And in my version, he was just Iron Fist. And it was those little things like that, and also some very small details. But otherwise, I was so relieved that basically he had very few notes. So that was a huge relief. And then, yes, I did write not actual, but I wrote a anyway, I wrote a short Tennessee Williams play in the book. And the only way, talk about intimidating, but the only way that I could write that was because I told myself, I wrote it into the story that it was a bad Tennessee Williams play. So I could never write a good Tennessee Williams play, but I feel like I felt reasonably confident I could write a bad Tennessee Williams play. Because as much as we love him, he wrote some really bad plays toward the end. I mean, they're all way better and more interesting than the one I wrote, but very few of them really worked after. I mean, that's part of the reason. Also, another reason why I wanted to write the book.
But he suffered from depression.
Of course, yeah, that's exactly what I'm about to say. Is that one of the reasons why I felt like he couldn't really get his North Star back is because one of the reasons is because he no longer had Frank, and that's not the only reason by any stretch, but he said specifically that after Frank died, he went into a 7-year depression, but he really was the rest of his life. And he was so desperate to get his reputation back that he would try whatever the latest trendy thing was to write about. So he wrote a lot of sci-fi and wrote a lot of political stuff, and he just was trying on all these different hats, and none of them were really him, you know? And so, not surprisingly, he couldn't really get it back. But again, there are some people out there who are trying very hard to resurrect that reputation and trying to argue that his later plays are actually way better than people give them credit for, and that's great if you have that opinion, and I support that, but that's not exactly how I feel, so.
So, I haven't read any biographies by Tennessee Williams, so I don't know if there's sex in them, but there is sex in your book. You're not afraid to write about their
Read
sex.
his memoirs, anyway.
Okay, good to know. So I'm kind of though curious about the sexuality of the time. So Williams died in 1983, and when you were mentioning that, like, you didn't even realize that he was gay, and when I was thinking about it too, like, I remember too, like, thinking it was a rumor, right, or something like that. You had to kind of read between the lines. Do you know, like, how out they were during this time? What was it like for them to live an authentic queer life, in the 50s in Italy? And, did he ever come out, like, officially?
Whether he actually, like, made an announcement, I don't know. But one thing that I think I didn't even realize is that if you're I talked about that sort of stratum of, like, that level that they occupied, right? When you're in that level of fame and power and money and all of that in the artistic world, even in that time, you can kind of do whatever you want, right? I mean, on some level, right? There's a kind of protection that kind of privilege gives you. And so among the people in that group, they weren't in hiding, by any stretch. At their parties, at events, whatever it was, there was no hiding. And I also want to emphasize what one Tennessee Williams scholar, David Kaplan, was always reminding me to remind people is that Williams had no shame about being gay, and neither did Frank, frankly. There was very, very little. He enjoyed that aspect of his life. He was sort of brazen about it. He had a voracious appetite, and he celebrated that. He wrote about people who had different elements of shame, and of course there were moments where dealing with mostly his sister where a lot of these things came out, but he wasn't shrinking away, wasn't hiding necessarily. But of course, within that stratum. Officially, though, as I mentioned in the reading, Frank was his secretary, and when they traveled, he traveled as his secretary. So they were kind of cosplaying, right, as writer and secretary and assistant and all of that. And so they were able to navigate the outside world that way, and then in that insular world, they were able to kind of be who they were. And then after a certain point, I mean, you think about like Truman Capote and whatever, and Tennessee Williams on these like old 70s, 80s, 60s talk shows, Dick Cavett or whoever, like usually they were drunk, and then which was not fun to watch, but also a little fun to watch. But also just being very flamboyant, and it was sort of like accepted without being accepted, kind of. It was understood without being accepted, kind of thing, by the general public, you know. But again, within the actual world, it was fairly. There wasn't much drama around. Oh, there's no agony of like, will I come out? You know, it's not Heartstopper. You know, like they're not like agonizing about like, are they going to be their authentic self? You know, they're working within the constraints of the time. So.
Yeah, there was that scene where they were talking about the City and the Pillar by Gore Vidal, and like how like he had never gotten another review in the Times after that book, right? And you know, and at some point too, like, you know, John Hornburns, who is also gay and has a storyline in the book as well. You know, there's a scene where John's lover Sandro comes to Frank to see if there's any way to convince Tennessee to like help John out, you know, Tennessee just can't bring it upon himself really to do anything about it, and you know, Frank says, you know, you can't think of anything at all that you're willing to do for him. You know, he's a fellow soldier. And you use that word soldier again that you used to.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, like, did you get the impression that how cutthroat were these literary circles in the 1950s? You know, because they were friends and they were frenemies. You know, but they were all kind of like queer, so they all kind of, you know, were they kind of looking out for each other, or were they just in competition with each other?
I mean, I think it's definitely a little bit of both, and I'm always the first to say I'm not a Tennessee Williams scholar. I'm not a scholar of that world at that time. But the way I understood it was, you know, yeah, you did certain favors for your fellow writers, like when you could, but otherwise it was kind of every man for himself. And there was such a narrow, you know, they're occupying a crowded, narrow space, and so they were trying to kind of make sure that their place in that space was as strong as it could be. But one thing I'll say that reminded me is that the problem that they saw with someone like Gore Vidal is that he was almost like too open in his work in a way that wasn't like Tennessee was. So much of Tennessee's work, like if you think of something like Suddenly Last Summer, or actually almost all of this plays, Cat of Hot Tin Roof in particular as well, it's so many things are encoded, like, or suggested without being explicitly stated, and so much subtext, and so much of what is unsaid is a big part of the story. And I think the problem they have with someone like Gore Vidal is that he was saying the thing. And you're not supposed to say the thing, not because you were afraid necessarily of being ostracized or people not buying your books, although that was of course a concern, but because it wasn't artistically interesting, right? It was too easy, or not easy in an artistic way, not easy in a sort of public relations way, if that makes sense. So I think that was part of it. Like, no, don't do that. Like, you're supposed to tell it slant. You're supposed to give our experience in a way that can be interpreted and not just, you know, put out there for people to, you know, it was like too explicit, too vulgar. It's the word I would use. Yeah.
So there was competition, you know, and you know, the book really demonstrates the burdens of fame, both also in the storyline, you know, as well as in Tennessee and Frank's relationship. In the Frank storyline, you know, Frank wants to be an actor, wants to be a leading man, and how hard do you think it was to be in this world with all of these great artists and struggle to be seen for himself, not just Tennessee's lover?
I mean, that's definitely one of the central questions of the book, and one of the central questions I had for him as a character, because the Frank that I knew, something that I researched, I don't say this in a pejorative way, but he was a dilettante, essentially. He was an actor, but he couldn't really cut it as an actor. He was a dancer, but he couldn't really cut it as a dancer. Wanted to be a writer, but he couldn't really cut it as a writer. He loved opera, but he couldn't sing. So like he couldn't find his place as an artist, and so he had to figure out, like, who am I? And I think if I could kind of talk, sort of connect with him, I would tell him, like, I think, he was really essentially a born caretaker. Like that was kind of his true calling, I think, was to take care of other people. And that's what he did for Tennessee, but he couldn't really, again, this is my interpretation, but he couldn't really accept that that's all that he was born for. Like, he felt like he was born for something a little bigger, right? And then when his relationship with Williams fell apart, and then he had got sick, he really just, he didn't really know what to do because he didn't really have anything to fall back on. He didn't have a driving passion, to do anything else other than take care of people, and there was really no one to take care of. So I really, really related to that as someone who, is someone I've always had an inverted relationship with my parents, like always being, like I was the child, but I was really the parent of my parents, and always taking care of them. And it's hard to sometimes figure out who you are when you're always the person who is doing things for other people. That was another way in which his life kind of resonated with mine. And it was very poignant to me that he was surrounded by all these artists and nobody thought of him as an artist, and people treated him as just Williams' latest flavor of the month, and they didn't really recognize him for who he was. So, yeah.
So you mentioned this, and we learned it early in the book. Like you said that Tennessee did not really visit him in the hospital, so he died alone.
He did come eventually.
He did come eventually, but we do know that he dedicated. So there's the question of, like, how much did they love each other? Like, it was 15 years. Was it like 15 years? And so we know that Tennessee dedicated the rose tattoo to Frank, right? Like, to Frank in return for Sicily is the quote. And that the leading man in the play was also based on him. But in real life, did he ever write explicitly about Frank?
He wrote a play called Something Cloudy, Something Clear, in which Frank appears as a ghost on a beach, as one of other. It's not a great play, but it's like a Williams figure on a beach, and all his ex-lovers kind of appear on the beach, and there are kind of glimmers of Frank in other ways in other plays. But my favorite thing that he wrote about Frank actually is a poem that it's very short. Yeah, I just feel like I just have to warn people. Whenever you start pulling out something to read, people like see the fear in their eyes. A poem that Williams wrote after Frank died. And so what happened was he did, and I don't know if this spoils the book or whatever, but in real life Frank did languish in a hospital for a while, and would go back and forth from Williams's apartment to the hospital, and then and then stayed in the hospital and died in the hospital. And Tennessee wouldn't visit him, and then finally he did. And then the day that he finally visited him, Frank died. And then a few weeks later, Williams wrote this poem called The Final Day of Your Life. And it's never been published, and so when I was doing research for this book, I came upon this poem, and I saw that it had never been published. And I think that it encapsulates like the sort of dynamics of their relationship, and also the tenderness in their relationship, and what we admire about Frank, which is his ability to kind of take care of things, as I said. So I'll just read. I also find it very moving. It's called The Final Day of Your Life. As I sat by your bed, the final day of your life, you snatched the oxygen tubes from your breathless nostrils, crawled out of bed, and sat up straight in a chair. I said, "Oh, Frank, why don't you stay in the bed?" And you said, "I'm too restless." A few moments later, you crawled back into the bed, and then a few moments later, crawled out of it again and sat up straight in the chair next to mine. We didn't look at each other, and all I was able to say is that you seemed to be stronger. I went out drinking that night in the company of friends that were mine, not yours. And when I returned after midnight, a telephone call let me know that you had died at 11. Sorry, actually, I got emotional every time I read this poem. It has taken me several weeks and several changes of place to know this thing that they told me. But now that I know it, I know it. And I know, too, lost companion, that something of you will stay quietly beside me. As once, when a motor failed on a 2-motor plane over mountains, and I started to panic, you sat there quietly beside me, reading a book, as if it were much more important than our possibly, almost probably crashing in flames on a mountain. So I mean, to me, that sums it up. You know, so, yeah.
That was beautiful. You know, I think it's so poetic that, like, you know, he was someone who struggled to be seen, and you obviously saw him,
Yeah.
and you obviously kind of did a great tribute to him. So, congratulations. I have plenty of more questions, but I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask some questions as well. Does anyone have a question for Chris? Oh, over here, Michael.
Well, I have 2 questions in case the first one's a quick no. So I don't know if you've seen the latest Wes Anderson movie that features character.
I just saw it the other night. Yeah.
Alright, so because you were speaking of layered approaches where things are unsaid, and kind of that movie is very layered and complex.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel that the Tennessee Williams character in that, did you feel that the play that character created made sense for Tennessee? I keep going back and trying to figure out where was Tennessee Williams in that movie? Were the characters a Tennessee Williams character, or was it just? Yeah, I'm kind of still trying to unpack the impact of that character.
It's called Asteroid City by Wes Anderson. Yeah, it's funny. I didn't know that. I don't like to read anything about movies before I go. So I had no idea there would even be a Tennessee Williams-esque kind of thing going on. And so I didn't really even think about it until midway through. Like, wait, this is kind of a Williams-type figure going on here. And I don't know how intentional it was to make him that way. I think there are definitely echoes of him, like the kind of sad, glamorous actress, like the Scarlett Johansson character, the kind of longing that she has and that people have for her and the main character has for her. I think there are definitely elements of it, but I don't know if it, again, I haven't thought much about it, but I don't know if it sheds really any light on Williams as a character as a figure that we haven't seen before. But honestly, I haven't thought much about it.
And the quick follow-up, yeah. Well, hopefully quick, is it, are there fictional versions of Tennessee Williams that you were inspired by at all, or that you didn't want to repeat?
Yeah, I mean, I did not want. Well, one thing that I was very grateful to the people I spoke with, who are the Williams scholars and other people. I also spoke to a guy who called himself the last living lover of Tennessee Williams. This guy in Chicago. I flew to Chicago to meet with him, and he talked about his time with him and. Other people, and one thing that, again, this guy David Kaplan, who I owe a lot to, who runs the Provincetown Tennessee Williams Festival, kept emphasizing to me, like, the world doesn't need another portrait of the, like, drawling, drunk, like, character who also is miserable, right? Like, yes, that character does appear on some level in at least one scene in the book, because that was part of his life. But he was like, please don't emphasize that. Please emphasize that he loved his life, that he loved Frank in his own way, and that while he had his demons, he loved what he did, And so I tried to put at least some of that, in the book, and not try to, reproduce those cliches. It's also hard though, because he doesn't actually have that many scenes in the book, to be honest. It's more sort of Frank is the central character, and I was very conscious that for readers, when they have Tennessee on the page, they want him to speak in kind of witty, dramatic dialogue. So you're kind of at you have cross purposes. Like you want to tell a different version of Williams that people haven't seen, but you also want to be true to to who he really was and to what the audience kind of wants. So I did kind of struggle with that a little bit. Good question.
Anyone else?
I have a few books of Tennessee Williams. I brought one along.
Oh, cool.
His essays.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, great. That's great. Yeah, that's great. He wrote all the time. He wrote every day. He revised everything. If something wasn't working, he would, toss it aside but never throw it away. He would come back to it decades later and rework it into something else. Like a poem became an essay, became a play, became a story. He painted. He was constantly creating. And I really, that's one thing I did emphasize that I think people don't really talk enough about, that I really emphasize in the book, is that he worked his ass off, right? And every time I feel like a lazy writer, which is most days, I think about him and how he just was at the desk, at the typewriter every single day, and would really very rarely give up on any project. If he would turn whatever he had into something else if he needed to.
So I'm just going to shift gears for a second here. I read the book on vacation in Italy. I took it to the beach. There's a lot of sand in my copy. You chose to write about a time in Tennessee's life when he's in Italy.
Yeah.
And I know that your first 3 books are also set, first one's set in Italy and the other 2 are about kind of Italian immigrants in the United States. What is it about Italy? Well, actually, also just to say, I came back and I was talking to people and then they would look at me and like, you went to Italy? And I could see in their eyes, it was like, we understand each other because we've been there. Like, what is it about that place for you that you find so kind of inspiring?
Yeah. Obviously I have a very personal relationship to it in the sense that my parents were both born in a small Italian village, and I grew up hearing their stories of what it was like to live during World War II and the close ties of this village and all the way of life, which was it's not a Greek wedding. But of just it's everything. We were talking about this a little bit. Everything you say when you talk about Italians always sounds like a cliche because it's food, it's family, but that is really what it was like. Hearing from my parents about what meant something to them was the tight-knittedness of family and the focus on food and tradition and all of that. And in general, I think when people go to Italy, and when I go to Italy, I see the way, and again, this is all speaking very broadly and generally because I know that this is certainly people have all types of different experiences. And I can speak a little bit as a gay man of when you don't fit into the traditional notions, as wonderful as the Italians can be, they can be equally difficult, to put it mildly, when it comes to that. But you do see I think people see, especially coming from an American perspective, they see how hard we work, right? And how the first question when you meet someone in the U.S. is, what do you do? Right? Always, right? And when I meet people in Italy, usually that's like the 6th or 7th thing that we talk about, right? There's usually other things that they want to hear about. And so I think it's not really a good way of answering your question, but because it's, again, so hard to think about, what about Italy? I love that. It doesn't sound like a cliche, but it's the whole, it's that, for example, my cousin, she, had children, and then when the children got older, they built a different part of their house so that the children could move in with their with their partners. And then when her mother got older, they built another part so the mother would live there, and they were all together. And that happened with so many of my relatives and so many families in Italy. And then here, I still hear my mother's shock when she talks to somebody who says, she has a daughter, she lives in Seattle. It's so far away. Why did she go so far away? What's wrong with her? And so which was why it made it so hard for me when I moved away. And I think people sense the kind of, while there are problems, while these things, the kind of cohesion around family and tradition that we especially in the U.S. don't have very much of. And again, a lot of that comes with many trade-offs, especially if you don't fit in exactly. But for the most part, I think that's what people respond to. Other than of course the beauty. So, yeah.
Okay, I want to give people a chance maybe to talk to you afterwards, get their book signed and stuff. But just one last question because you mentioned it. Do you want to share that Liv Ullmann story?
Oh yeah,
Maybe...
No, it's good. Yeah. No, it's a good story. I promise. So I told her I was writing about Tennessee Williams, and she said, "Oh, I met him once." And I said, "Oh, I said you have to tell me the story." And so she said it was the 70s, I believe, and she was a huge fan of Williams, and she actually went on to direct a very successful version of Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway later in her life. And anyway, but she was a huge fan of his in the 70s. She found herself in a hotel lobby in Paris, and she was in the hotel lobby, and Williams was across the lobby, and someone said, "Oh, that's Tennessee Williams," and he had his dog with him. He always had bulldogs, right? And so he had his bulldog with him. I forget which one, because he had so many different bulldogs. And she was too nervous to go up to him because even though she was a star herself or becoming a star, she was too nervous to go up to him. So she got this idea because she saw the bulldog kind of amble away. And so she got this idea to write him a little fan note, right? And so she scrawled on a piece of paper, some fan note, "I love you, Tennessee Williams," like, "I'm Liv Ullmann," or whatever she said. And she went over to the dog and she tucked the note under the dog's collar, right? And then she kind of stood back and she watched as the dog and Williams reunited, and she saw Williams look at the collar and take the piece of paper and open up the piece of paper, and read it, and then kind of look around, and then I guess he noticed her or recognized her or saw her from across the room. And he looks at her and he comes marching over and she's all excited, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so glad I did that," or whatever. And he comes over and he thrusts out the paper and he says, "My dog is not your fucking mailman." And then he walked away. And that was it. And she never met him again. So don't meet your heroes, I think.
All right, well, let's give a round of applause to Christopher Castellani. Thank you, Christopher. What happened? You came, you didn't Thank you all also for being here tonight. Thanks again to the Instituto Italiano de Cultura Montréal. Thanks also to the Équipe de Recherche en Études Queer au Québec, Blumet, and Paragraph. So have a great evening. Please stick around. Thank you again.
Thank you.